Hey everyone, this is Jacob Paulson with ConcealedCarry.com, and we're doing something a little bit different today. You know, it's July 4th season. It's the holiday weekend, and this time of year, there's so much crazy bombardment from online and retailers like us who are holding sales. So you're getting tons of emails about, hey, sell this, sell that, buy this, buy that. And while we certainly want to celebrate in our own way, we also don't want to neglect what Independence Day is all about. And so as a company, we kind of had that conversation about what are some of the things we're going to do to make sure we still keep the spirit of 1776, the spirit of the holiday, what it's really about. And a couple of things we've done. You've noticed on our Facebook pages and Instagram accounts, we've posted a lot of memes with gun quotes from founding fathers. We hope that you like those. We hope you share them and take advantage of those. But we also decided to put together this video, which is going to be essentially a good war story. Not my war story, our war story. The story that we all share in common, which is that of American independence, the Revolutionary War from 75 to 83 or ish, whenever it concluded. So I drew the lucky straw to be the one to share a story with you today. I want to preface this a little bit. I brought some of my favorite books here onto the camera because I want to tell you about some of the books I think you might consider reading. I don't do this to brag because I'm in no way an awesome historian, but over the last 10, 15 years, I have read a handful of books, and from these I derive some of these great stories that I remember, that I keep close to me to help me remember what's important about our country and what really makes us us, what makes our country tick. What our origins really are. And so with that, there's a lot of stories you probably are familiar with. You've probably heard about, Washington crossing the Delaware, which is a great book in here somewhere. Washington's Crossing, fabulous book. You should go read that, get all the awesome details. Another book I like to, I at least try to read it every year, is 1776 by David McCullough. And the story I'm going to tell here in a few minutes is in this book, along with a few of these other books. But this is a great book. I have the full and the abridged audiobook as well of 1776. So most years I just get around to listening to the abridged copy, which is like 5 CDs. And that helps me stay fresh on some of the most relevant things about our country's independence. But the majorities are available in audio format. I've listened to most of these, but they're great books. And so I'd encourage you to consider that. Another book I'll talk about real quick before I get into my story is Founding Mothers. I think sometimes we get so focused on the founding fathers that we forget about the women that were in their lives and the women that were influential in our nation's freedom, in our nation's independence and growth. And so this is a great book, Founding Mothers. I cherish this book a lot. I have a signed copy. I sent this to the author and she signed it for me and sent it back. And I was very grateful for that. And my daughter, one of my daughter's names comes from this book and from one of our founding mothers, Mercy Otis Warren. So those are a few of the books I thought I'd highlight and just say, if you haven't studied our history, this is a fun way to do it. Go buy a book. Most of these you can get on audio. You can get the CDs. You can get them from the library. You don't have to buy them. And, learn a little bit about our nation's history. There's a lot of great ones here about Washington. His Excellency George Washington is over here somewhere. Great book. Just the book Washington. It's this one from Ron Chernow. I think that's how you pronounce the author's name. He's got a couple of books in this pile. Great book. There's a lot of great stuff here from Joseph Ellis. That's an author. I think there's probably 5 or 6 books here from Joseph Ellis. Founding Family, which is about John and Abigail Adams. Phenomenal read. John Adams itself, which is in here somewhere, is the book that they made into the HBO series, which is a phenomenal read. I'm a raving fan of John Adams. And there's a great one in here about the character of Thomas Jefferson. I think it's over here somewhere. Yes, American Sphinx, the character and life of Thomas Jefferson. So a lot of great books, but if I had to give you just one, go get 1776 if you haven't already read it by David McCullough. He's got a lot of great history books. This might be the only one he's ever written about the founding generation, but he's got one about Truman that I've read and a couple others, Morning on Horseback. It's really good. So David McCullough is great. So 1776. So here's a story I thought I'd share with you today. And this is a story about Henry Knox and about the Boston siege. So essentially in 1775 is when George Washington was voted, assigned, called, whatever we want to call it, to go and lead the army. He was selected, or I should say, he was nominated by John Adams in the Continental Congress, and by vote he was they agreed on that, and so Washington accepted the honor, as he referred to it, and he took off to Boston, which is where the army basically was at that time, if you wanted to call it an army, and so he went to Boston. It was a disaster. There was between 10 and 15,000 people at any given time, but they were not very fit soldiers. They didn't have the right equipment. They didn't have enough gunpowder. The whole thing was a bit of a disaster. But he got there in the summer in Boston. And essentially what was going on is Boston, the city itself, was basically occupied British territory. The British Army was there. General Howe, I think General Clinton was there at that time. There were a couple other British generals, and they really had the city on lockdown. Basically, in the city, you only had loyalists or Tories, as we might call them, and that was it. And then the American Army, the Continental Army, what do you want to call it? They had essentially surrounded that city, and they had laid siege. And British, they have all the power in the water, right? They had the largest navy in the world at the time, and so the nature of Boston and Boston Harbor is they were controlling the waterways, and the Americans had set siege. And this lasted for a long time. Basically, the siege was from summer 1775 all the way through mid-March 1776. But let me tell you what ended the siege and how it was a success for the Americans. One of Washington's officers was a man by the name of Henry Knox. And Henry Knox was from Rhode Island. He was a bookseller, if I remember correctly. He sold books, loved books. He was a very learned person because he read a lot. And so Henry Knox was an officer in the army, and he essentially approached Washington and had a great idea. He said, listen, up at Fort Ticonderoga, which I think is in Canada somewhere, I'm not entirely sure on the details, but I know it's on the border. Up at the fort, we won this great victory. We pushed the British out of the fort, but we abandoned all the cannons, all the artillery. We just left them there because it was logistically too challenging. Let me, Washington, Henry Knox, go up to the fort and retrieve the cannon. Retrieve the artillery. I'll bring them down to Boston, and boom, we'll be in good shape, and we'll be able to beat this thing. So Washington had great faith in Henry Knox as an officer, and he gave him a small budget, some cash, and said, "Yeah, go get the cannon." So Henry Knox left in November, I believe, of 1775. And November is a cold season, but not necessarily the middle of winter either. But it was cold, and he left north from Boston up to Fort Ticonderoga. It's about 300 miles, as I recall, the journey. And this is a time when we don't have cars, we don't have trains, we certainly don't have airplanes, right? So we have horses, we have oxen, and we have boats. And that was basically the way you got around. So he went, and he took his brother with him, and maybe a handful of other men. And when he got there, he assessed the situation. There were a lot of cannon that had been abandoned. And he, essentially determined and selected and gathered up 58 total cannon artillery from the fort, and said, these are the 58 we're going to take back to Boston with us. Now, it's a tough journey, this was a challenge. He spent months getting these cannon 300 miles back to George Washington. First off, a cannon is not a small thing. It's not a light thing, right? It's a big, massive, heavy chunk of metal. And so it's a challenge to move it regardless, but even more so in the middle of winter across several river crossings and the wilderness, essentially. And so it was a rough go. And this story kind of became a very famous story at the time, and even today, a lot of people know the story. So he brought all the cannon from Fort Ticonderoga. He had to sail down a river that was almost frozen. They were breaking ice as they went. They couldn't use the sails because the wind was blowing the wrong direction. So they were literally rowing these boats all the way down the river. I think they spent 7 days. Just right off of the fort is a river, and so they came down the river for like a week or something like that. Just rowing, and it was a tough go. It was against the wind. One of the boats almost sunk. They had to get it to shore and essentially patch it, repair it, and then get it back out. But they didn't lose any of the cannon, and so that was pretty phenomenal. Once they got to the end of the point of that river, they had pre-commissioned on their way north a group of people to build sleds. Henry Knox had this great idea that we're going to build sleds. We're going to put the cannons on sleds, and we'll just pull these with oxen. The problem is that he was counting on snow. He figured if there was a good amount of snow, it'd be easy to pull these things on the snow, but no snow. So he had to wait for a winter storm, which luckily, or perhaps by providence, as they might have said it, we got a huge winter storm a few days later. 3 feet of snow dropped. And so it was a huge blessing. And Henry Knox was able to load up all 58 of the cannon on sleds and start to pull them. It was a long journey. I won't get into all the detail, but they had to cross the Hudson River, I think, more than once. There was a lot of river crossings. It was a really long journey. And they essentially got to Boston in late February of 1776 with the cannon. It was a huge success. And imagine, a procession of people pulling 56 cannon. Every city they stopped in, people would come out and cheer, and they'd get more volunteers to help. It was quite the view, quite the visual, I'm sure. And so it would have been remarkable to see 58 massive cannon being pulled on these sleds across 300 miles of winter wonderland. So he gets to Boston. Washington is thrilled, right? Just pumped. He has artillery now. And it was a little bit rough because the artillery of the army didn't really know what they're doing. In fact, they destroyed a few cannons and killed a few soldiers in the process of trying to figure out how to operate these things. They're mostly French cannons because Fort Ticonderoga was a French fort originally, French pushed out by the British, and of course then the British pushed out by the colonials. And so they were French cannon. And here's the cool part, though. This is where we get into the good story. Well, the whole story is good. So what happens is Washington convenes a council of war, and once again, I think it's the fourth or fifth time, he's trying to convince his council of war to attack the British. And once again, they say, no, not a good idea. We shouldn't attack. We'll lose this battle, and we won't survive to fight another day. But what they do decide to do is to occupy Dorchester Heights. So Dorchester Heights is essentially a hill that kind of surrounds the southeastern part of Boston Harbor, and it overlooks the city in such a way that if either of the two armies had occupied it, it was a very serious fortifying position. And up to this point, months had gone by, and neither army had chosen to occupy Dorchester Heights simply because the logistical effort needed to occupy it without being attacked was very challenging. And so basically, it was an impasse. It was like, no one's going up there because it'd be too hard to get up there. It just would be too much. And the British had kind of, several times they'd written in their memoirs and things that if the American army summoned to Dorchester Heights, they would either be forced to fight or to run, that they couldn't just sit there and be subject to the cannon or to the army sitting at such an elevated position of strength. So essentially what they determined to do is that they're going to occupy Dorchester Heights all in one night. Now, you can't just show up there and start building all your fortifications. You're using your shovels to build fortifications, right? You're digging ditches, you're throwing up timbers and things like that. And so what they decided to do is they spent several days in advance building all the fortifications on the ground, and then they decided at night they'd just march them up there and put them into place and then fortify them. And that would save some time. So they kind of hatch the plan, they schedule it out, they have a date set to march the cannon up there, and they start working on everything. And for the 2 nights leading up to the planned night to occupy Dorchester Heights, they just do a lot of cannon fire, a lot of artillery firing. The theory here was that we want to distract the British from what we're going to be doing over here, right? We want them looking over here. And it also kind of created this precedent in terms of noise. Cannons are very loud, and both nights the British returned fire, and it didn't really hurt anybody. It wasn't a big deal because neither army was in a position to really hurt the other, but it did create a whole lot of noise, and so that was very promising. They thought, okay, great, tomorrow night when we go to mount the Dorchester Heights, we're going to have a lot of distraction, a lot of noise. It's going to be very effective, and so we're going to do this. And then something interesting happened on that night that was chosen. It was perfect weather for this occasion. In fact, there were many officers and people who remarked in their journals and memoirs and letters that it was the best out of 365 days that they possibly could have had for this task. Not only was the weather good, so that they didn't freeze to death in March 2nd or 3rd or 4th or something like that. They didn't freeze to death pushing this stuff up the hill, but furthermore, it was warm, but they also had this unique, interesting fog or haze that essentially rested around the base of the hill so that people on the ground couldn't see to the top of Dorchester Heights. They had no idea what was going on. But from the top of Dorchester Heights, it was clear as a whistle. There was no fog, there was no clouds, and so they essentially were able to get up there and build all their fortifications under cover with completely invisible to anybody on the ground. It was providence. It was remarkable in that regard. So the next morning, now you have Dorchester Heights, which is occupied and fortified, cannons, breastworks, everything. And the British wake up, and General Howe is said to have said that something to the effect of, my God, these boys did more work in one night than my army could do in a week, or something like that. He was shocked. The British woke up, they're just like, oh, crap, we are in big trouble. And essentially they decided, what are we going to do? So they decide we either have to attack or we have to flee. And fleeing didn't sound like a real great option at the time, so they decide to attack. And so they prepare for a day or so, and they start to push the boats down river toward the army so they can attack. But the winds that day, in an unusual way, pick up and push back against the boats. And the British are unable to essentially achieve the position they need. And after a day or two of this just nasty weather, they decide, you know what, screw it, let's just get out of Boston. So they do. They spend the next week or so evacuating the town, which was quite the feat. You're talking about thousands of soldiers and their wives and their kids and their furniture and all the loyalists who didn't want to stay into town and be left there. It was quite the deal for them to leave town, but that they did, which means that the first real big confrontation, and I know that we had Bunker Hill and we had Lexington and Concord, etc., but this was a huge siege. This was building up, all the armies getting big, fortifying themselves. This first real direct conflict of the war, in terms of Washington leading the army, turned out to be a success without a shot fired, because the British gave up Boston and left. As you know, the rest of the war didn't go that easy. 1776 actually turned out to be a pretty tough year as the British arrived in New York and occupied Long Island and pushed the Americans out of Long Island. And for a long time, Washington essentially had to run and pick his fights. And at the end of 1776, we had a phenomenal win at Trenton, New Jersey, when Washington crossed the Delaware on Christmas Eve. So that's another story for another day. But America is great, and our legacy is important. Understanding our history, where we came from, and how we got here is a big deal. And it helps us understand what I think, for one, is providence. I think that, in my personal opinion, that we're here because of divine intervention. This country exists, that it was meant to be. But at very least, you can believe that our country was founded by some really amazing, smart, and intelligent people who understood what it meant to live under tyranny. They understood what it meant to create a democracy and a republic. And they were inspired beyond all reason. It was amazing. So I hope that you've enjoyed the story. I hope that you'll go and learn more about our American history, and you'll enjoy this Independence Day this year. And if you haven't already, also go check out our podcast. Every year on the podcast release date closest to Independence Day, we do a special episode dedicated to American history and how it plays into our world of armed citizenry. So go check that out if you haven't already. From Denver, Colorado, this is Jacob Paulson. Happy birthday, America.